Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Ready or Not, the Legal Landscape for Cannabis. My name is Tracy Fox, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we jump into this fascinating topic, we just have a few housekeeping items for you. First of all, this webinar series is provided by the University of Calgary Scholars, and information presented is a summary of the scholars' research. You can submit any questions throughout the duration of the webinar, and you can also check the resources provided in the right-hand side of your screen. Keep the conversation going live on Twitter during the webinar using hashtag #ExploreUCalgary, and please give us your feedback through the survey that'll be available at the end of the webinar. I'd like to introduce our speaker today. This is Lorian Hardcastle. Lorian is the Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Law and Cumming School of Medicine. She's a member of the O'Brien Institute for Public Health and Conjoint Health Research Ethics Board, and her research interests include healthcare regulation and governance, patient safety, comparative health policy, and the self-regulation of healthcare professionals. And you can follow Lorian on Twitter at Lorian_H. Welcome, Lorian.
Thank you for having me.
So before we kick off into the content today, we have a poll question for you. We'd like to know who's in the audience. So if you could take a couple of seconds just to check all that apply to you, and then we'll see what the results yield. And it looks like we're already getting quite a few questions in. I think this is a really hot topic.
Yeah. Well, it's just a few months away now, so people are certainly interested in what will happen.
Definitely, and I think we have nearly 800 people registered for today's webinar.
That's great.
Yeah. So let's see how we're doing with our. So we have some law professionals and students of law. We have some policymakers on the line. We have some fellow researchers on the line, and a lot of folks just interested in the topic or identify as others. So I think we have a lot of folks who are interested in today's topic. So why don't we jump into the content?
Great. So this slide just is a bit of a roadmap of where we're going today. I wanted to give a bit of an overview of the federal regulations, what's going on provincially with a bit of comparison to other provinces. What Calgary is doing at the municipal level, and then finally we'll hit on some other legal and policy issues. So beginning then with who's responsible for regulating what, cannabis is interesting in that all three levels of government are involved, and they have several areas of overlapping jurisdiction. And so the main thing the federal government is doing relates to the criminal law, advertising, medical cannabis, and production. As you can see, they have quite a bit of overlap with the provinces in terms of possession, impaired driving, public health, taxation, so they're sharing responsibility there. The provinces are doing things around workplace safety, how cannabis is distributed, and the retail model. And then the provinces and the municipalities are looking at where cannabis can be consumed in the public, how the retail locations will be set up. And then the municipal governments have responsibility for land use and zoning. So they have a bit of say over where stores can be set up, how close they can be to schools or other sorts of facilities. So it's really complicated because all three of these levels of government kind of needed to come together to get this done quite quickly. So to delve into some of these, before we delve into some of these, we have a poll on kind of among these legal issues, what concerns the audience most?
Yeah, so question back out to the audience. So what concerns you most about the legislation of cannabis? We'll just take a couple more seconds to see if you can answer the poll, and we'll see what the audience has to say. Let's just check on our questions here. All right, let's see what we have. So looks like lots of people are concerned about the increased youth consumption of cannabis and workplace accidents associated with cannabis. And then there's a fair number of people who aren't really concerned, which is interesting.
Yeah. Well, and at the end, I think you're going to talk about an upcoming webinar on the youth consumption. Yes. So I won't steal too much of their thunder today, but that certainly is coming.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe then to delve into what's happening at the federal level. So one of the main features of the federal legislation does actually relate to youth and minors. So just as the public is concerned about that, so too is the federal government. And so the federal legislation restricts the ability to grow and possess cannabis to those over 18 years old. It also makes it an offense for people to sell to minors. And it prohibits advertising and packaging that specifically targets minors, which is not dissimilar to things like tobacco. In terms of possession then, the federal legislation also sets out the fact that people can grow up to 30 grams, or sorry, people can possess up to 30 grams and can grow up to 4 plants in their homes. The federal legislation leaves it up to the provinces to be stricter in that regard, but that's what the federal law sets out. A third feature of the federal law is that it sets out a number of offenses. So selling to a minor, violating marketing and advertising rules, illegal distribution or sale, and import or export. And I get a lot of questions about that. If it's illegal in a state like Washington and it'll then be legal in BC, can I bring it over the border? And the answer is no. So the federal legislation does prohibit that import and export. Another feature of the federal law is that it discusses packaging, marketing, and promotion. So as I mentioned before, it can't be packaged in a way that appeals to minors. There are limits on advertising that are similar to tobacco, so no sponsoring of events and no lifestyle advertising. And lifestyle advertising is basically associating cannabis with a lifestyle that includes, to quote the legislation, glamour, recreation, excitement, vitality, risk, or daring. And then the final feature of the federal law is that it addresses the cultivation issue. So federally, cultivation and processing facilities are regulated. There's a whole bunch of restrictions around security of those facilities, personnel clearance, production practices, quality assurance. So those facilities are regulated in the federal law. To jump into Alberta's law, as I mentioned, one of the areas of shared responsibility between the federal government and the provinces is who can possess and sort of the quantity that they can possess. And so Alberta has stuck with the federal legislation. They haven't gone stricter. So they've kept that legal age of 18, the 4 plants, and the 30 grams. And this is in contrast to some other provinces. Some other provinces have gone a little bit stricter. So this map just shows what some of the provinces are doing in this regard. Several have increased the age to 19, and that is because the drinking age in many provinces is 19, so they wanted to have uniformity there. As you can see, some provinces won't allow any home cultivation, so the only place it'll be available there is in retail stores.
Before we move on, I have a question that has come in.
Sure.
So in Alberta, people will be able to grow up to 4 plants in their house. There's a question regarding can you grow a plant in a household with children in the household?
It's not prohibited to grow a plant in a household with children, and I think one of the reasons for that is because in its plant form, there's not a high level of toxicity. Right. If you were to eat a leaf, and it's also sort of expected that just as there are cigarettes in homes and parents are able to kind of keep those out of reach of children, right, so too, could they do that with plants? And I think the other thing too is, cannabis plants aren't like growing a cactus. They're difficult to grow, and so I don't expect there to be tons of home cultivation. Okay. Most people aren't growing their own vegetables, and these are much harder to grow than vegetables. So, but some provinces did look at kind of strengthening where they can be stored. And so there was certainly discussion around should it only be in locked rooms or places that are inaccessible to children. So there was discussion around that,
but no restriction in Alberta.
No.
In terms of where you can grow. Okay.
So delving a little more deeply then into Alberta's regulations, one of the areas that Alberta addresses is impaired driving, and this is an area of concern to some people, as we saw in our poll. And so one of the things that Alberta does is no consumption of cannabis in vehicles. They also set out a number of penalties for impaired driving around things like vehicle seizures and roadside suspensions, that sort of thing. So not dissimilar to the sorts of concerns that the government has had around alcohol. Another area before we move on, this slide just shows. This was a study that was done in the U.S. There are several jurisdictions that have legal cannabis in the U.S. And this slide just shows that these concerns around impaired driving aren't unfounded. As you can see, alcohol has been a factor in many vehicle-related deaths, but cannabis has also showed up in some of those cases. So it's certainly not an unfounded concern. Another area that Alberta's legislation hasn't yet addressed, but that the province is keenly aware of, and our poll indicated that the public is aware of it too, relates to impairment in the workplace. And so there's a lot of concern, especially in Alberta, with the kinds of industries that we have, with people working with heavy machinery. And of course, it's often a young male population, which is also the population that consumes cannabis at the highest rates. And so there's certainly a concern with impairment in the workplace. The legislation doesn't yet address that, but the government has said that they're keeping an eye on whether or not that becomes an issue and whether or not further regulation is needed there. A third area that the provincial law addresses relates to retail. And this is really one of the main features of the provincial law, is how can it actually be sold, or where can it be sold? And so what Alberta does is it's very similar to alcohol. So the province controls distribution and wholesale of cannabis, just like they do with alcohol. And the province will also be the only online retailer, but will license private retail locations for retail sales. So you can either buy online through the government or at retail stores, but the province is the one that's responsible for kind of granting those licenses. And the map on the next slide just shows a bit of a contrast between what Alberta's doing and what some other provinces are doing. Much like Alberta, several other provinces will have private retail stores. Most provinces are planning on keeping alcohol sales separate from cannabis sales. Nova Scotia is a bit of a lone wolf here, where they will sell cannabis along with alcohol in government-run stores. A couple of provinces won't be doing private retail. They will be doing only government-run retail. And so, for example, in Ontario, where they sell alcohol in government-run stores, so too will cannabis be sold in government-run stores. So there's a bit of a mix in what the provinces will be doing in terms of public sales or private sales. A couple of provinces, in Alberta, it's government-run online sales. A couple of provinces are actually going to allow private online retail. So lots of variation there, and it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out, and whether or not those differences in sales models lead to differences in terms of rates of consumption or those sorts of things. So then, to move on, a third feature of Alberta's legislation is where it can be consumed. And so right now the province is regulating it very similar to several other provinces and to how they regulate tobacco. So in most of Alberta, pending municipalities who have chosen to go stricter, in most of Alberta, you will be able to consume cannabis where you can consume tobacco. So most places in the public with certain restrictions, for example, schoolyards, that sort of thing. Okay. And we'll come back to what Calgary's doing there in a minute, but for most of the province, it'll be very similar to tobacco.
And we had a related question.
Sure.
So you said that you can possess 30 grams. Mm-hmm. Is that inside the home or outside the home? It sounds like you can carry it around with you outside.
That's right.
There's certain places where you can consume it.
That's right. So it's 30 grams sort of on your person in public. Okay. And it sort of has to be that way because, of course, you have to go out in public to the retail location to buy the 30 grams to, say, take it home. So that's 30 grams of public possession. Okay. And you may conceivably have more than that in your home because, if you're cultivating or what have you.
But you can only buy 30 grams at a time. Sort of.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. That's to line up with the amount you can purchase is meant to line up with how much you can have on you in public.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so I wanted to show a little bit of cross-country comparison on this issue of where it can be consumed. And so this map shows that several provinces are taking the Alberta route where tobacco or cannabis can be consumed, where tobacco can be consumed. A few provinces, though, have gone stricter and will only allow consumption similar to alcohol, so no real public consumption. And so several provinces will be doing that no public consumption route. So again, it'll be interesting from a research perspective to see what happens in the provinces with public consumption and those that have strictly limited it similar to alcohol. And actually we have a poll on this.
Another poll. So the poll for our audiences, how do you think cannabis should be regulated? So if you can take a couple of seconds just to answer. Similar to alcohol with no public consumption, similar to tobacco with public consumption generally permitted, or I'm not sure. I wonder if most people will be, I'm not sure, because it's such a complex question. All right.
And with tobacco, of course, we've really very much ramped up to the point that we're at. It was very gradual. This is a decision that has to be made sort of in the moment.
That's a good point. Yeah, it did take a lot of years to get where we're at.
Yeah.
To where we're at with tobacco, yeah. Okay, let's have a look and see. Oh, 62% say similar to alcohol with no public consumption. Are you surprised by that?
I am not, because the city of Calgary did a study and found similar results. So it seems to be that that's the route that most people want to go. Although, there are discussions around, well, what about people who live in apartments? If those apartments have banned it, should the provinces who aren't allowing public consumption have cannabis lounges? What about music festivals? Should special permits be granted to that? So even within that no public consumption, there are those areas that are certainly being discussed by many municipalities.
And of course, this doesn't include consumables or edibles at this point, right? It's strictly
right. We're not at the point yet where edibles are included in the legislation. Okay, so the final aspect of the provincial law that I wanted to hit on was the retail stores. And as I said before, the bulk of the provincial legislation really does address the retail store issue. So the legislation restricts the licensing of these outlets, the activities of these stores. The province has said that it's going to license about 250 stores in the first year. And it also sets the hours for stores, so from 10 a.m. to 2 a.m., which is, those are the same hours that alcohol stores have, so they've made that uniform. Stores have to be 100, in the provincial law, cities can go stricter, but in the provincial law, stores have to be 100 meters from schools or health facilities. Stores can only sell 30 grams in one transaction, which we discussed. Cannabis, there are security measures, so it has to be kept in a locked display case. Stores have to be alarmed, video surveillance. Staff have to undergo background checks and mandatory training. Minors aren't allowed in the store. And then there's also restrictions around market concentration. So one person or organization can't own more than 15% of the stores in Alberta to kind of keep that market a little more diffuse. So as I mentioned before, the provincial law sets a floor, but provinces or municipalities can go above that and have stricter regulations, and several have. So I'll just use Calgary as an example then. So the municipalities had to address three sort of different models. The three models were, do we treat cannabis like any other retail store where people can just open it wherever they want? Should we require what's called a land use designation, which means a full public hearing for every single store, or more of a middle ground, which is these aren't quite like other retail stores, so we'll have some restrictions around them, and that's the route that Calgary and most other municipalities have gone. And so the three main points at which the municipalities are able to strengthen provincial law is where stores can be located, what hours they can sell, and where it can be consumed. And several municipalities have gone stricter than provincial law. And so the first one that I wanted to talk about were where stores can be located. So the city of Calgary did a pretty extensive survey, and 81% of people responded that there should be a buffer zone between cannabis stores and schools. 76 said there should be a buffer between organizations that treat vulnerable people and cannabis stores. And then 61% supported limits between, the distance between cannabis stores. So Calgarians certainly were concerned about where these stores would be located. And so, as I said before, the province has that 100-meter buffer zone between schools, hospitals, and cannabis stores. And the city has decided to go stricter than that. So, for example, they're going to require 300 meters between cannabis stores. So, and so the city is still discussing that, but there is certainly public support for those kinds of buffer zones. The other issue, or the other area where municipalities can go stronger, was in terms of the hours that stores are open. And so the city's poll, 59% wanted the same hours that alcohol stores have to apply to cannabis. 31% wanted shorter hours, so cannabis available fewer hours than alcohol, and then some wanted it available longer. And what the city has decided to do was to leave the provincial legislation alone and to go with that 10 a.m. to 2 a.m. This is an interesting area, though, for researchers, because some provinces won't have stores open till 2 a.m. Some of those provinces, like Ontario, where it's going to be sold similar to alcohol, will have shorter hours. And so it'll be interesting for people concerned about impaired driving. Do provinces like Alberta, where stores will be open longer, do they end up having more cannabis consumption in the evening and higher rates of impaired driving accidents involving cannabis than those provinces that don't have it available so late at night? So that'll be an interesting comparison, and hopefully policymakers will be willing to kind of review their laws as that evidence emerges. So a third area that the municipalities can go stricter than the provincial law is where it can be consumed. And as I mentioned before, provincially, Alberta treats it like tobacco. Calgary, however, and perhaps in response to their survey, has decided that in Calgary, cannabis will only be able to be consumed where alcohol is consumed in public. So very limited public consumption. And so the survey, as you can see, 55% of people wanted to treat it like alcohol. 32 wanted it to be treated like tobacco, which is what the provincial law says, and then several people said other. But this is, several other municipalities in Alberta won't have this, and so one municipality that I've heard that will be leaving the provincial legislation in place is Cochrane. And so it's interesting because it comes right up against Calgary. And so if you're in Cochrane, you can consume in public, but if you're in Calgary, you can't. So really interesting. So we'll see what happens there. But Calgary has decided to go with sort of the public support and be stricter. And I think we actually have a poll on one of these issues. We already asked people about where it should be consumed, but I think we have a poll on one of the other issues.
Yeah, now we're asking the audience, what hours should cannabis stores have? The same hours as liquor stores, more restrictive hours than liquor stores, or less restrictive hours than liquor stores? So if the audience could go ahead and take a couple seconds to answer that question. Interesting to see if it lines up with what the Calgary survey is telling us.
Well, and the respondents were very similar on that where it should be consumed question. So,
okay, let's have a look. Yeah, pretty close to the same hours as liquor stores. But quite a few still with more restrictive hours than liquor stores. So almost.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's tied to that kind of impaired driving concern. I'm not sure. But that's it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out in terms of the public health evidence that actually comes out after the fact. Does consumption go up in those provinces with longer hours? Are there more impaired driving accidents? It'll be interesting to see how that plays out on the evidence. So moving on then from the legislation to a few kind of remaining legal and policy issues. One of the issues that keeps coming up is what about medical cannabis? Should we have these two regimes where you can buy it recreationally or you can buy it medically, or if people can already buy it recreationally, should we just get rid of the medical regime? And there are certainly strong feelings on this issue. One of the concerns is around the cost and access to people who consume medically. So currently, very few insurers will cover it. And of course, if they abolish the medical regime and it's just done recreationally, no insurers will cover that kind of self-medication. And so people who consume medically, many of them feel very strongly that there should still be a medical cannabis regime in addition to the recreational cannabis scheme. And certainly there is pressure on insurers to cover it for medical reasons. And it's a bit of a kind of technicality, but most insurers currently only cover medication that has gone through the drug approval process and is given what's called a drug identification number. But cannabis hasn't gone through that approval process, and so a lot of insurers kind of use that as the basis to deny it, to say it's not really a drug, it doesn't have a number, and so most insurers are currently covering it, which is a topic of some controversy among medical users for sure. There are also issues around dispensing and prescribing. So unlike pharmaceuticals, where doctors are given pretty detailed information from pharmaceutical companies around dosing, around what conditions it's indicated for, they just don't have that same information for cannabis. And so certainly there have been at least anecdotal reports of people going to their doctor, asking for a prescription, and the doctor having no idea kind of how much to prescribe. And of course with cannabis, it isn't like pharmaceuticals where they're formulated very consistently, right? Each pill has the exact same amount of the active ingredients, that sort of thing. I mean, cannabis varies much more in potency. And so some of the medical users, one of the reasons they want a separate medical regime is because then, we might see these recreational stores and then separate retail stores for medical users where, they do have knowledge around some of the dosing and more expertise in that area. Despite the fact that doctors are concerned and that many doctors don't know how much to prescribe these sorts of things, they don't have clear guidelines. There are currently 439 Alberta doctors prescribing cannabis, so it isn't uncommon. All of that being said, there was a study that came out a couple months ago now that reviewed the literature on cannabis and tried to provide some guidance to these doctors. And what this study showed was that it's currently being prescribed for a wide array of conditions. Some of those conditions, there's not really good evidence that the cannabis is effective for. Others there is some evidence it's effective to some extent, but that it's being prescribed for a wide array of conditions and isn't effective for all of those. So, some doctors say that they want to get rid of the medical regime so that it's all just done recreationally because of this mixed evidence, because there isn't that good data from the pharmaceutical companies. So it'll be, we're kind of in a wait-and-see position. The government has said that its current plan is to keep the dual regimes, but it is possible in the future that we could see that medical regime abolished in favor of just allowing people to purchase recreationally. Another issue that's on the horizon is edibles. As many people will know, the government's plan is to incorporate edibles into the legislation about a year after that October 17th deadline. Edibles are complicated because they require you to think about both the drug side of things, but also the food side of things. Government regulates both food and drugs, and this is sort of a crossover product in a way. And there was some caution from some U.S. states that regulated edibles. Some states didn't come up with separate regulations. They brought them in all at once. And there were reports of confusion around serving size and the amount of THC in each serving. Oftentimes, the edibles in candy form, it'll be a single candy, which ordinarily, if it was just candy, you would eat several. But some of these candies actually contain 5, 6, 8, 10 servings. And you wouldn't necessarily know that if you didn't really read the dosing instructions or talk to the person at the retail store, because most people aren't cutting candies into multiple portions. Edibles also have some unique health concerns that I think the government is concerned about. They take longer to affect the body, which can result in overconsumption. Because you eat one, nothing happens, you eat another, and then people have overconsumed. So that's one of the concerns with edibles. Some people have linked that to driving as well. You have one, you think you're fine, you drive, you weren't actually fine.
So is that why they're waiting a year before introducing the edibles legislation, so they have time to think all that through?
Okay. Yeah, because all of this happened quite quickly, and so this will give time to sort of sort all that out. Another concern with the edibles is the risk of children. Apparently the most common edible product is gummy bears, and so of course we're concerned around whose hands those might get into. And as you can see from the slide, it shows the gummy bears in a clear package. One of the things that will probably be unlikely is to have gummy bears in a clear package, right? So, should they be in opaque packages so that people can't see into them? All of those sorts of things will have to be sorted out in the legislation. All of that around how the packaging, how the packaging can look. So all of that will have to be sorted out. Okay, so another area that is maybe also a bit of a wait and see is landlord and tenant law. So landlords are quite concerned about what this means for their properties. And this could be addressed provincially or municipally. But what do we do about people growing and consuming in these multiple unit dwellings, like apartments or condos? Some condos are on top of this, and the condo boards are rushing to amend their bylaws to prohibit home cultivation or consumption. For human rights reasons, they probably have to have an exception for medical consumption in those buildings, but to generally prohibit the cultivation or the consumption. Alberta hasn't proposed any new landlord-tenant laws. Landlords, though, are starting to lobby governments, both in Alberta and elsewhere. BC has said that they're considering their options. Saskatchewan and Quebec have come out and said that they will allow owners of these multiple unit dwellings to restrict use. Ontario has said we're leaving our laws alone. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But as I mentioned, landlords will have to accommodate that medical use or face a discrimination claim, but they're interested in lobbying government to have stricter rules around not allowing consumption. Again, though, that in a place like Calgary, where there's no public consumption, if you're in an apartment and you can't consume there and you can't consume in public, some of those individuals are starting to lobby government for cannabis cafes or these sorts of things. And just in terms of numbers, so the 32% of renters have said they consume cannabis, while only 12% of homeowners do. So this is, in some ways, very much a renter's issue. And 68% of those who are interested in growing are renters, and many of those people would be in those multiple unit dwellings. I mean, so I think this is an issue that people are concerned about. I would say, though, that of course I think sometimes people overestimate the desire of tenants to grow their own cannabis. It's not an easy plant to grow. So we'll see how many of those tenants who are currently say they're interested in it actually do go ahead with it and are successful in growing these plants. So just a few other policy issues that I wanted to hit on. The first is an economic. The industry is currently valued at $23 billion, which is huge. This includes growing, but this also includes ancillary activities like tourism. It's expected that, much like Amsterdam is a bit of a cannabis tourist destination, that parts of Canada could be as well. Banff is very concerned about this, apparently. And so, but despite this industry being currently valued at $23 billion, some people are arguing that stock prices are on the bubble, and that it's been overvalued, that consumption isn't going to skyrocket with legalization, and so that's a bit of a wait and see situation. There's also a concern, though, that supply will not be sufficient to meet demand. Several provinces were quite slow at teeing up suppliers to actually stock these retail stores, so it's a bit of a wait and see situation. But But there certainly are economic opportunities here. Canada is supplying several countries with medical cannabis right now, several European countries. So there certainly are these economic opportunities. As this quote suggests, there's also some federal provincial tensions around these economic issues. Initially, the federal government wanted a 50-50 cost share of the tax revenues. So the federal government proposed that they share revenues 50-50. And the provinces, of course, responded with, well, all the cost for administering this comes out of our pockets. So the federal government has relented to 75-25. But if this does prove to be expensive to regulate, even that 75-25 split in favor of the provinces, that could be a subject of some ongoing controversy. The other issue is that the governments can't get too greedy about potential tax revenues, because if they price cannabis too high, people will just get it from the black market. So you kind of need to arrive at that sweet spot in pricing where many people are going into these retail outlets as opposed to continuing to buy off the black market, where there won't be any tax revenue to share 75-25. And of course the added benefit too is, if people are not consuming on the black market or instead purchasing in retail stores, is of course then we have more data on who's consuming, how much they're buying, and of course from a researcher's perspective, that's we want that kind of information. Another area that is certainly the subject of some policy controversy discussion is policing. And so certainly there have been discussions among law enforcement that they're concerned about what this will mean for impaired driving. There has been some strengthening of impaired driving laws, but currently we don't have the same technology that we have for alcohol in the context of cannabis, right? With alcohol, they can do roadside testing, the breathalyzer. That same technology isn't there with cannabis, and so they're still doing kind of the roadside sobriety assessment tests, and those are sophisticated tests, but they don't have the same ability to kind of tell you the level of impairment. Cannabis is also a much more complex molecule than alcohol is. With alcohol, law enforcement has been able to, and provincial governments have public awareness campaigns around how much you can consume and sort of how long it stays in your body. Cannabis isn't the same. There isn't that same information available, and so we sort of have to see what will happen on the policing front. I mean, some people are saying that it will lighten the load because they'll no longer have to be doing these simple possession charges against people with small amounts. But then other people are arguing that, well, there will be different kinds of law enforcement issues. So more home invasions, more complaints about people's neighbors growing. So potentially, different kinds of concerns the police will face. And this cute dog is sniffs out drugs. And currently, if that dog alerts police that there's an illegal substance, or that the police have reasonable cause to search that vehicle, now these cute little dogs have to be retrained, because if they currently react, they could be reacting to a substance which will soon be illegal. So all sorts of law enforcement. Yeah. This one being the cutest. There are also, of course, public health issues, and these are getting a lot of discussion. The provinces and the federal government have said that they're devoting money to kind of public awareness, public education campaigns around the risk of cannabis. There's a lot of discussion around the risk of cannabis to youth. And so the number that's often thrown around is age 25 is the age at which your brain starts developing. And there was some pressure on governments to make 25 the legal age of consumption. I think the governments tried to be a little more sort of pragmatic and say, well, if we make the legal age 25, then all of those people that are younger than that will consume, on the black market. And so, if we make it a bit younger, then maybe we can kind of fold those into, the government retail locations where we know how much they're consuming and who's buying and these sorts of things. But there certainly are discussions around that age and the brain development evidence. There are also public health discussions, of course, around impaired driving, which I've hit on several times. There are also the discussions around grow operations and environmental impacts of these production facilities. So production waste, Also, what are the effects on the people working in these facilities? What are the health effects? So there are also these kind of environmental and worker health issues that we don't know a lot about, and hopefully the government continues to sort of study those and see what's happening. One note, though, that many researchers give on this public health stuff is, there are concerns, but again, it didn't skyrocket in other jurisdictions. Consumption didn't skyrocket in Colorado when they legalized, or in Washington. So, while there are these concerns, there's that caution to not get too worked up about them, to kind of wait and see what happens. And so those are the main policy issues that I wanted to hit on.
Great.
Maybe I will. I'm sure you have lots of questions.
We have lots of questions.
So I'll maybe turn it over to you for a second.
Yeah, let's get at some of these questions. We have a lot of great ones that have come in. Great question on craft or micro cultivators and producers licensing. Is there a plan to have some legislation come out that would regulate sort of that micro industry?
Certainly something the federal government is talking about. I mean, most of the licensing thus far has been to kind of the big facilities. They have sort of the economic power to have all their ducks in a row, so that when legislation came into being, they were ready to go. But certainly it is expected that there will be more of those craft facilities.
Another question on combining marijuana smoking with a general no smoking bylaw in a condominium. So back to the landlord-tenant piece. What is the legality of combining marijuana smoking with a general no smoking bylaw in a condo? Yeah,
and so landlords are going to be able to do that, or either in a landlord-tenant situation or in a condo situation. They can include cannabis in that no smoking bylaw. I mean, many of them, it currently reads no smoking. Some of them, though, are amending it to be clear that cannabis is included in that. But the legality is that it is acceptable for condos to ban smoking cannabis, just as they can ban, and most do, ban tobacco consumption. There is that loophole, though, that if somebody is a medical user, that preventing that person from consuming, there could potentially be a complaint to a provincial human rights commission that's discriminatory on the basis of disability, and that landlords have a duty to reasonably accommodate a medical user.
And a medical user would have to obviously have proof that they were a medical user.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. That's a great question. Can cannabis retail stores advertise on social media or have social media accounts to advertise?
So they can, but there's restrictions around what you can advertise, right? So a lot of your advertising will really just be, this is the name of my store, these are the names of my products. You can't associate it with a lifestyle. You can't, you can't target minors. So a lot of them, a lot of the stores, what they're talking about is doing kind of direct mailing to customers and these sorts of things.
And how will that be policed? The advertising piece of it.
The advertising piece, really in the same way that like tobacco advertising is policed, or pharmaceutical advertising is policed. I mean, historically the government has been slow to sometimes police pharmaceutical advertising, and so I'm not aware at this point of kind of what their enforcement staff looks like or what their enforcement capacity looks like. But the idea is that it would be policed, similar to the way other substances are.
Another question here on growing plants in households. Could a municipality create bylaws, so additional laws, to restrict the number of plants that can be grown in a household?
It could. None have, though, to my knowledge. I mean, obviously there's hundreds of municipalities in Canada, but the vast majority of provinces have just left that federal law in place, and no municipalities, to my knowledge, have tried to go stricter on that. One note, though, on that home cultivation piece that often comes up is the initial federal legislation had a height limit of 1 meter. That is no longer there. But I wanted to throw that in because some people still have that impression, because the original material that was released by the federal government said there would be that height restriction. So there's not.
So 4 plants and they can grow as big as you please.
As big as you can, right? Again, I think people overestimate their ability to grow cannabis. But yeah, no municipalities that I'm aware of have done anything to attempt to limit those 4 plants.
Okay. And related to that question, might they require permits for growing to ensure proper electrical or ventilation to reduce any hazards associated with that? I think they can grow up type situations.
I mean, so the facilities that are licensed production facilities, they have all sorts of requirements around, what the facility looks like and how it's configured and these sorts of things. I mean, home cultivation, municipalities can always have laws around, what electrical is required, these sorts of things. I mean, when you do renovations to your house, you often have to get an inspector to come and sort of license your electrical, these sorts of things. So that certainly is within what municipalities can do. I'm not aware of any municipalities, though, that are considering, that these 4 plants would be more of a pressure on your electrical system than, whatever million devices we all currently have plugged in. So I'm not aware of any that have been sort of specifically concerned that these are going to place enough additional pressure on someone's electrical system that, if you're going to grow your 4 plants, that you have to have some upgraded electrical. I don't think any municipalities have said much on that. I haven't. Not only am I not aware of any passing any rules around that, I'm not even aware of any kind of addressing that issue or it being part of the discourse. So that is a question I had never heard before. So that's interesting.
Maybe another wait and see situation.
Yeah.
Another question about non-smokers. So what about the rights of non-smokers? How do you accommodate my right and my children's right to fresh air if my neighbor smokes?
Well, and I think that's part of the reason that we've gone stricter. Calgary's gone stricter, and Calgarians supported going stricter was because of non-smokers and treating it more like tobacco, where where some provinces are treating it more like tobacco, where there is that issue of non-smokers being subjected to it. I think that's maybe why a lot of Calgarians wanted this to be treated stricter like alcohol was because of that. And certainly this is a topic of much discussion, mostly in the tobacco sector, but increasingly will be in with regard to cannabis. This idea of, well, where should people be allowed to consume, where should they not? Some municipalities ban even tobacco consumption in all public parks. Vancouver does, for example. So I think with the tobacco, we've seen stricter and stricter rules, and because most provinces are kind of piggybacking their cannabis legislation on their tobacco legislation in terms of where it can be consumed, as provinces or as municipalities go stricter, we might see, because there is certainly this discussion of non-smokers' rights, especially as rates of tobacco consumption fall as they have, and fewer and fewer people are smoking. You do get kind of louder voices in support of non-smokers. But certainly in the tobacco context, there's discussions around, for example, in apartments, because it lingers or it goes to other units. So I think that just as that issue's come up in the context of tobacco, so too are people being pretty vocal about it here, and I think Calgary heard loud and clear, and that's why they've restricted public consumption, and perhaps we'll see other municipalities follow suit. But but again, that's kind of a wait and see situation to see what happens.
Yeah. So, question about quality assurance. So, are there any laws going to be put in place for quality assurance of the stuff sold in retail stores?
Yeah. So the focus of quality assurance is further upstream. Right, so they want quality assurance before it even gets to a retail store. The focus on quality assurance is at that production level. So those production facilities have pretty significant requirements around quality assurance. There's also what they call a seed to sale tracking system. So they'll know what came from what facilities, and so if there is some quality assurance issue that arises, the consumers are raising some quality assurance issue, they'll be able to track, what that consumer got right back to the production facility it came to. And so I think that right now the focus on quality assurance is very upstream from the retail outlets.
Okay. Interesting question about the types of products you can get starting October
Mm-hmm.
17th. So starting on October 17th, will dried cannabis be the only recreational product available? I think what they might mean is versus oil or other things.
Oils will be, but the edibles won't be.
Okay.
And so,
So dried leaves, oils,
Yeah.
those are the only
Yeah.
two products. Okay. Edibles remain illegal
right.
for
Right.
the foreseeable future.
Right. Although, certainly people are sort of gearing up to make their own. I heard about one, the cake mixes you get, like the Betty Crocker, the whatever. I heard of at least one person who's producing the cake mixes with the intention that you go and buy the product to incorporate it, just like you would put an egg in a Betty Crocker
very
cake mix.
entrepreneurial.
So certainly people are thinking forward.
Yeah. Okay. If there is concern regarding cannabis consumption and impairment while driving or in the workplace, why do you think Alberta was the only province to not include anything in their updated occupational health and safety regulations? And they're referring specifically to Bill 30.
Yeah, well, Alberta, in some provinces added it is more of a matter of clarification than it really sort of changing things. I mean, in Alberta legislation, and you cannot come to work impaired. And that means cannabis, that means alcohol, that means, harder drugs, that means, you can't.
Cold medication, really.
You need to be fit to work.
Mm-hmm.
And so, obviously this concern comes up more in Alberta due to the kinds of industries that we have, but you have to be fit to work. And if you're not fit to work, then, employers, can address that. I mean, one of the issues that comes up though a lot is, well, what about these medical users and that sort of thing? And again, you have to be fit to work even if you're a medical user. Now, if you're a medical user, your employer has a duty to kind of accommodate that. So that might be giving you leave and you're able to come back to your job to sort of deal with that issue, or putting you off heavy duty onto something where your medical use doesn't pose a safety risk. But even in Alberta, regardless of the fact that the legislation wasn't changed, there is still those kind of generic rules that don't specifically mention cannabis, do still exist.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be fit to work,
Regardless of the substance.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's a very interesting question. Do you have any information about how those with criminal records for marijuana possession or trafficking, etc., pre-legalization will be dealt with going forward?
Yeah, and so this is an interesting question, and it's certainly one that those with these kinds of convictions, are very interested in. The federal government has talked about it. There certainly are people pushing the federal government to sort of retroactively pardon people with possession charges. They haven't said that they're going to do it yet, so the federal government hasn't said they're doing anything yet. But the trafficking is more complex because, of course, depending on the amount that was trafficked, what you did then might still not be legal under the current legislation, right? Because under the current legislation, you have to have a license to sell. You have that 30-gram limit, and so kind of depending on the nature of someone's trafficking conviction, it might still run afoul of this legislation. I mean, it isn't ordinarily the case that when a law changes, the government kind of retroactively pardons people. This has been an area where there's been much discussion around that because, some people with these very minor possession charges, might feel like the charge was kind of ridiculous or what they did was fairly minor. And there's also a lot of people with these kind of charges. So there is pressure on the government to do it, but there's no obligation on the government to address the issue because, just because the law changes, whatever governed at the time governed at the time. But there is some discussion that maybe they will. But with the trafficking, that's more complex because it really depended on sort of what happens. But there is pressure on the government to kind of address these possession charges, just because now it is legal. I mean, I know certainly the governments have kind of ramped down their enforcement of cannabis. There are many cases where prosecutors use their discretion and don't prosecute. There are many cases where, for a minor sort of amount right now, even though it's legal, judges grant a discharge or it's not prosecuted, or the sentence is minor. I think I have a colleague who does criminal law who said that there are very few people currently in jail for possession unless it was a parole violation or unless there was something else going on.
Right. Or maybe like a really large amount or something with intent or...
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting question. Will other countries be able to deny entry to Canadians who have legally used cannabis? Or?
Well, I mean, other countries control their own borders, and so it is possible. But for the purposes of diplomatic relations and whatnot, we're not normally in the practice. I wouldn't expect it. I don't think that. I don't think that countries sort of routinely are denying entry to Americans from Washington or from Colorado or to people from the Netherlands. I think for the purposes of international relations, that's just not something that we would do or that other countries would do. But technically, you do control your own borders. So technically, they could, but I just it hasn't happened before, so I just don't see it happening now.
Okay. And we have a good clarification question here.
Sure.
Is October 17th the actual date that the products can be purchased, or is it that the date of legalization and there will be a lag time for, like, are the stores going to open their doors on October 17th and away we go, or?
There will be a lag time.
There will be a lag time.
Yeah. Because it is an interesting area of the law where you have the sort of overlapping areas of jurisdiction. You have the federal law coming into place, but then the provinces have their own kind of legislative schemes, and then the municipalities. So there is that. There's always going to be that sort of lag. That being said, I have driven by the stores. Provincial licenses have been granted. I've seen stores that are in various stages of construction. So they I think they're going to be ready to go as soon as the government gives them the green light.
But will they be able to get the product before the 17th of October?
Probably not.
Oh, okay.
And there are concerns too with there not being enough supply, or where's the supply coming from. So I think there'll certainly be a bit of a lag time.
Here's a question about testing. So you mentioned that we don't really have good impairment testing for cannabis yet. And the question is, are we any closer to having that? Has there been a development in that space?
There apparently are technologies that are being tested. So that is something that the government is wanting to invest money in, is wanting to get done. I think I've heard of several sort of companies that are testing or piloting or trying to develop devices. So I don't think it's not imminent that we'll have it, but I think down the road, hopefully they'll have that. But that being said, it's not as though they don't do roadside sobriety testing currently for people who are impaired with cannabis, and so they have various sorts of questions and look at your pupils and all of those sort of things. So they have that in place, but I think the technology, the estimates that I've heard of that is probably a couple years out.
Oh, okay. Well, lots of great questions. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. Thanks everybody for all of your great questions. And so the slides and the recording of this webinar will be available immediately following. And then please fill out the survey. We'd love to have your feedback. And please do also sign up for other webinars, download the ebooks and the other resources, and watch other videos on the outcomes of our scholars' research at ucalgary.ca/explore/collections. And we have another upcoming webinar on cannabis. So this one's specifically on cannabis legislation and youth. There was lots of interest in that, so I think we'll have lots of attendees at that one. That one is next week on July 26th. And email any ideas that you might have for other UCalgary webinar topics to explorecalgary@ucalgary.ca. Thanks everybody and have a great day.